Hi folks, in this video we're going to be looking at painting the very retro 80s style green computer screens that pop up all over the Space Marine Army, but most commonly on bikes. So without any further ado, let's cue the music. To start out, we need to lay down a nice black-green base coat for the area that's going to be our computer screen. And to do this, I have chosen Caliban green from Games Workshop, but you can use any dark green that you prefer. Thin this down with a little bit of water and look to cover this area in 2 to 3 thin coats. For the first highlight, I will be thinning down some Warpstone glow quite heavily to almost a glaze consistency. And with this, I'm going to start a directional tint highlight onto our computer screen. And to do this, I'm going to be working downwards from about the halfway point in directional strokes towards the bottom of the screen. And as you can see on this first pass, this paint has barely affected the colour of the screen at all. And that's what we want. As you can see, it's thin enough that it's barely covering and doing a nice translucent layer, but it's viscous enough that we can still quite concentrated pull a nice thin edge highlight with it. So what you need to do with this is just to make sure this paint is nice and thin, and don't worry too much about being exact with this, just make sure you're doing those directional movements towards the bottom of the screen from the halfway point. With each pass, try to cover a smaller area than each previous stage, and as you do this you'll start to notice a really nice transition of colour start to build up on the screen. I'd recommend doing 5 to 6 passes with this, but do this to a point until you're happy with it. For our next highlight, I'll be coming in with some Moot green from Games Workshop, and with this I have thinned this down a little bit more than normal, and I'm going to do a zenithal edge highlight. And what I mean by this is I want to edge highlight where the light is going to hit the panel the most. So I'm going to highlight the top piece and the side piece. And if you really want, you can do a little one across the bottom, or you can thin this heavily down and work in a top to down motion to create the transition even further. The advantage of keeping this paint thin is that upon your edge highlights, if you feel like that you've gone a bit too chunky, you can rinse the brush off and then you can wick away and feather backwards and forwards against the paint to thin out that line. If you've kept this paint quite thick, it doesn't quite work so much. But if you keep your paint very thin when you're doing this edge highlight, you will really find that you can do that. Once we have our edge highlight in place, we can now start to think about any markings or screen interest that we want. And to start out with, I'm going to do a radar screen. And to do this, I've started by doing a vertical line in the middle of the screen, separating the screen into a left area and to a right area. Once that's in place, I'm then going to do 45 degrees to split each of those areas in half. And I'm doing this basically from the top corner down to the middle bottom, or you can do it from the middle bottom out into the corner. It depends whichever way works best for your hand motion. And the trick with this is to, before you actually touch the paintbrush to the model, is to mimic the motion with your hand in the air. Get comfortable with the moving of the brush. Know the stroke that you're going to do. Get that muscle memory down with your hand, and that's going to help you do this in place. Once we've got our vertical and our diagonals in place, we can then start to look at doing our horizontal screens. And to do this, I'd recommend, if you're new to doing this, to break it up into sections. So I'm quite comfortable with this motion, and I can do this in one long stroke. But if you can't, I would do just connect each first bit. So from the edge to the first diagonal, diagonal to the vertical, vertical to the diagonal, and diagonal down to the bottom. It's just a matter of keeping your paint slightly thicker than you'd normally thin down from a layer. You want to get as much control as you can with this. And just take your time, mimic the brush action in the air before you go onto the model. And take your time, and don't stress about getting it wrong. If you get it wrong, wait for the paint to dry, and come in with your base coat colour and neaten up and have a go again. For the last green highlight, I have made a 50-50 mix of Moot green and pure white. Now the white you use doesn't really matter from which brand, just any white will do. And for this, I'm redefining some of the edge highlights and any lines that I think might have been lost on the background. And so it's just a matter of taking your time and using the edge of your brush to pick out those sharp edges and corners where you want this brightest highlight to be. I'm doing the top and the sides of this screen, and if you really want, you can go in and you can redefine the radar screen or targeting screen shapes if you really want to add that extra layer of pop, but they are fine just as they are from the previous step. It's entirely up to you. To really sell the idea that this is a radar screen showing a target, come in with a small dot of your favourite red paint into one of the sections. It doesn't need to be large, and I wouldn't do more than one. Just give the impression that this Space Marine is hunting down a target. And with that, the radar screen on this Space Marine bike is now complete. Remember, the real secret with this is taking your time and doing those practice motions with the brush before you put the paint onto the model to really help you position the lines that you want. You might want to practice on a piece of card or paper before you do it onto the model as well to improve your technique. Once you get the idea and the practice of the motion that you're doing with the brush, you can do all sorts of different designs. Here is what the Space Marine Storm Speeder I've done, and these are using exactly the same techniques, using the same brush motions, and just doing straight line different designs. You can give a whole array of different screens for your Space Marine vehicles. So if you liked this video, why not consider subscribing? It's free of charge, it helps me out, and you get further videos in your YouTube feed just like this one. So, until next time folks.